Hola, mi amigos. ¿Qué pasó? Bienvenido a Yacht Historia. The history of Mexico, on a very basic level, shares a lot of similarities with the history of the United States. You have a large chunk of land that was colonized by a European power. In the case of Mexico, it was Spain who called dibs first. Then that European power was eventually pushed out through an independence movement. For Mexico, their official independence came from Spain in 1821. Now, as far as borders go, much of the modern United States used to be a part of Mexico, land that was lost after their defeat in the 1848 Mexican-American War. And like the United States, they went through their own civil war. The Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century was, by all standards, a civil war. That's where legendary names like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata were born.
A Latino?
But did you know that Mexico had another crisis and conflict around the mid-19th century, right around the time the United States was having its civil war? And this conflict saw the reemergence of European powers in North America.
We are back, baby. We are fucking back. We're back.
For backdrop, Mexico's first real break with its traditional Spanish overlords was in 1821, when it declared its independence from Ferdinand VII's absolutist crown. It sounds like a United States breakdown from Europe, but it wasn't. Mexican-born but Spanish royalist general Agustin Iturbide aligned himself with the insurgent elements and essentially made himself a new monarch of Mexico, which didn't last long. By 1824, he was ousted and the Republic of Mexico was established. Cool, we're off to a good start. To give a general political breakdown of Mexican politics during that time, it was basically split between liberals and conservatives. The liberals wanted the complete separation of Mexico from European powers and a republican government, more similar to the aspirations of their neighbors in the United States. The conservatives, on the other hand, were still clinging on to the idea that monarchy, albeit separate from Spain, would be best for the future of Mexico. No doubt that many of these conservatives had previously financially and socially benefited from the Spanish rule in the region.
Give me some money.
But for the most part, the liberals had the support of the working masses, so any significant attempts to reestablish monarchy never really happened until later. Things like the loss of land in the Texas Revolution and the US's 1846 invasion of Mexico in the Mexican-American War had kept these two factions united to focus on other issues. In 1857, the liberal Mexican government created the new constitution that drastically decreased the powers of the Catholic Church and the army, which were institutionally conservative vessels. The conservatives said F no to that constitution, and in 1858, boom, Mexico beat the US to a civil war by 3 years. Now, theirs ended in 1861, just as the United States Civil War was beginning. That matters because with the US embroiled in their own civil war, there was no way for the United States to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which had been created right around the time of the Mexican independence movement in 1823, with the specific intentions of pushing and keeping European powers out of the Western Hemisphere.
Would you please leave without a fuss right now?
Okay.
As far as the Mexican Civil War went, once again the liberals came out on top. But now the conservatives had the opportunity to entertain the idea of planting a European monarch onto a Mexican throne because in 1861, as the Mexican Civil War came to an end, liberal President Benito Juarez had suspended all payments of foreign debts based off those debts mainly being incurred by the conservatives, which gave the European powers the conservatives had been courting for years the pretext to regain control in Mexico. And that's precisely what happened. This was a golden goose for Napoleon III of France, who could potentially establish Mexico as a client kingdom while creating a buffer for any future expansion from the United States, who had already been eating up French territories in the Americas. And since the Republic of Mexico was refusing to pay off the debts they made, while their monarchical factions were actively trying to undermine them, the French felt justified to invade Mexico under the idea they would force Mexico to renegotiate payment.
You gave me money, Peter. I want money, Peter.
They also convinced Spain and Britain to come along for the ride, as Mexico owed them money too.
We are back, baby. We are fucking back. We're back.
And while Spain and Britain did go along for the ride, they didn't stay for long as they quickly realized France's intentions were less about money negotiations and more about a full-on military conquest of Mexico. The French landed in April of 1862, and by May 5th, they were getting the ever-loving piss, shit, and guacamole beaten out of them at the Battle of Pueblo, a decisive Mexican victory.
But it works!
and Mexico lead France.
You may know it better as Cinco de Mayo, a day that is now celebrated by excessive partying where you're incoherently drunk by noon and mistaking your Puerto Rican coworker for a Mexican as you puke into your $5 sombrero that you picked up at the Mexican market that time in 2015 when you had a business conference in San Antonio. In all the Cinco de Mayo celebrations in the United States, one thing you never hear about is that Napoleon III sent in 40,000 extra troops and took Pueblo a year later in 1863 with the help of conservative Mexican generals. Enter Archduke Maximilian of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, he had a nice little thing going for him. Hi, this is an ad read. Today's episode is sponsored by the music video Hey Baby Que Paso, which is based off of the old Texas Tornado song of the same name. Oh, you never seen it before? It's just a cool Tejano song with really cool beats and cool lyrics and cool vibe, and it's like a 13-minute music video, like one of those old Michael Jackson videos back in the day where it's like, well, am I watching a movie or a music video? And that's precisely what it is. And I know it's really good because I know the artist in it, Zeus El Maronesio, because I directed the music video. So go watch it. The younger sibling of first-in-line royals were rarely groomed for power like their older siblings, which gave Maximilian a lot of time in his youth to study the arts and develop more politically liberal sensibilities, which were all the rage in Europe at that time. And Max, unlike his brother, had an outgoing and rambunctious personality. A likable guy who could have been destined to spend his years in service of his country without the pressures of being the #1 guy in charge. It certainly looked like that in the beginning. He accompanied and assisted his brother on military campaigns throughout Europe and built a nice career for himself in the Royal Navy. Going back to the 1850s, Mexican conservatives had met with Maximilian in secret about the possibility of him taking over as a monarch in Mexico.
And remember, it's our little secret.
As Maximilian was from the Habsburg royal family line, and they felt he was most appropriate to fill those shoes as his Spanish cousins, who originally conquered Mexico lands, were also Habsburgs. I'd love to go into a detailed explanation of what these family trees look like, but if you watch my first episode, you know it could take hours to explain. Maximilian was formally invited to become Emperor of Mexico in July of 1863, but he did have his own conditions, one of which he wanted to be accepted by the majority of the Mexican people. Now, the conservatives, they were able to bullshit him enough that this would be the case, that in 1864, Max stepped down from his naval duties and relinquished his Archduke title in the Austrian-Hungarian line to become the Emperor of Mexico.
Who's coming with me?
Maximilian I of the Mexican Empire was born.
You got the job, buddy!
Mexican conservatives didn't fully grasp who Maximilian was, like other nobles around Europe did. As soon as he took over, he was trying to create a more moderate and liberalized government, much to the chagrin of the Mexican conservatives. One thing he did was reach out to former president and staunch liberal Benito Juarez with an offer of amnesty, who still refused to recognize Maximilian's power. It didn't hurt that the American Civil War was starting to wind down, and the power up north was still staunchly backing Juarez as the legitimate leader of Mexico, as a new European monarch on the continent defied every intention of U.S. policy. Additionally, conservatives hoped Maximilian would restore certain powers of the church that were stripped in 1857. But Maxi Boy did nothing there either. In fact, he maintained that the church and its powers should be separate from the government.
So you get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
Which defied historical papal control over monarchies. He continued to undermine conservative efforts in many of the laws he tried to enact that gave more rights to Mexican citizens over the traditional, conservative powers. By April of 1865, those silly Americans were wrapping up their own conflict and were now focused once again on enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. While the US government was still trying to avoid intervention, private loans up to $30 million were being given in support of Juarez, and many of those Civil War soldiers who weren't done fighting began to join the guerrilla cause, further alienating many of Maxi's supporters, to which Maximilian, in a rare attempt at might, signed a decree that would lead to the immediate court-martial and death of any guerrillas.
Notify the authorities.
Nambe, sir.
Yes, Edgar. Nambe. That's the spirit.
An estimated 11,000 would be killed. By 1866, the French saw Maximilian's reign as hopeless and withdrew military support from him. Maximilian, like so many monarchs before and after him, entertained the idea of abdication in order to save himself and the country. But it didn't happen, as any attempt for a ceasefire would require Juarez and his increasingly powerful liberal army to acknowledge Maximilian as a legitimate ruler in the first place. By February of 1867, Maximilian and his still loyal 10,000 troops made their way into the city of Querétaro, where they were promptly surrounded by Juarez's liberal army of 40,000 troops. The Mexican emperor surprisingly held out for a few months, but knowing that his situation was dire and there was little chance he would stay in power, he attempted to sneak through the liberal army's lines on May 11th in order to make a break for the coast and return to Europe, which was thwarted by one of his own generals. By the 15th, the liberals had entered the city and captured Maximilian I.
¡Viva México! ¡Pero viva México libre!
After one day of trial, Maximilian was found guilty of conspiracy to overthrow the Mexican government and for his decree that allowed the execution of Juarez's guerrilla soldiers. And while many of Max's European family and allies pleaded for him to be spared, Juarez needed to send a strong message to Europe that the Mexican Republic would no longer tolerate foreign invasions. He was executed by firing squad on June 19, 1867, at the age of 34.
We fucked up.
Until the very end, Maximilian was polite with his execution. His last words, which he spoke in Spanish, were, "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be spilled, end the bloodshed which has been experienced in my new motherland. Long live Mexico, long live its independence." Maximilian I of Mexico is a tragic figure, a well-intentioned aristocrat whose sympathies were more often with the lower classes than not. But he bit off more than he could chew when he tried to pit his politically liberal sensibilities with that of the traditional power bases. Had he not been a foreigner in Benito Juarez's country, the two might have actually gotten along. One thing's for certain, the death of Maximilian I was the last time conservative factions made any real attempt to advocate for monarchy in Mexico. And if you happen to live in South Texas like me, there was another cool thing that came out of his brief reign over Mexico. Like I stated earlier, Max was a big fan of the arts and brought a small army of musicians with him from Central Europe. After his execution, they were like, what the hell are we gonna do now? Eventually, they made their way up into northern Mexico and southern Texas, where they brought their traditional styles of Germanic music and instruments, like the accordion, which eventually morphed in with some of the more traditional Spanish and indigenous styles of music. These hybrid styles of music became known as Norteño and Tejano music. So what am I trying to say? I'm saying that if Maximilian would have never made his failed attempt at Mexican monarchy, we would have never gotten Selena, or the Texas tornadoes, or... Hasta luego, muchachos. Au revoir. Das Liebe wohl. Goodbye. Please like, subscribe, and share, or I'm gonna leaving Las Vegas myself in the bar.
No bueno, no bueno, we have a new king. His name is Maximilian, and he's a foreign shit stain. You learned it here at Jacked History. Jacked History.